As photographers, we're often talking about how to get the correct exposure, but sometimes that involves either underexposing or overexposing. It's common for you to hear people talk about underexposing your pictures. It's less common to hear them talk about when you need to overexpose your pictures, but sometimes you need to do this. But I think first of all, it's probably better if we define what we're talking about when we say over or under exposure, because it sounds like we're getting the exposure wrong when we're not. So you've got your little exposure meter on the back of the camera. So when we say that we're underexposed or overexposed, most of the time we're referring to being in relation to what the meter says. So the reason we're talking about being over or underexposed is because sometimes our cameras guess, because that's what that is, and we need to remember that it is the camera's guess when that needle is at zero. Sometimes the camera is wrong, and that can often happen. We just need to be aware of when and why, and what we can do about it. So in this video, we're going to be talking about when to overexpose. And the reason that the camera will get things wrong and we need to overexpose is usually down to the fact that the picture is bright. There's bright things in the scene relative to our subject. So it seems to go against the flow of logic that when there's bright things in the picture, we need to overexpose. And when there's dark things in the picture, we'll have to underexpose. Again, I'm talking about relative to our subject. If the whole exposure balances pretty well, our camera most of the time is going to get a pretty good guess of what's going on. But a really good example of when you might need to overexpose is when you're trying to take a picture of your subject, but you've got a really bright sky. So the camera will see this bright sky and it'll be like, wow, that's really bright. Let's bring the exposure down. And when we're overexposing, it's like we're saying to the camera, no, it's meant to be bright. And that's the way to think about this with both under and overexposure. For instance, if you're taking a picture of a person and they happen to be in an area where there was a particularly dark background, the camera might say, wow, this picture looks like it's probably too dark. Let's brighten it up. So we need to underexpose and say to the camera, no, it's meant to be dark. That's the way to think about this. If you have a lot of bright things in your scene compared to your subject, your camera is going to get freaked out by that. And we need to say, no, it's meant to be bright. And the same when there's something dark in the background, your camera's going to think, well, that's really dark. And you tell the camera, no, it's meant to be dark. So the amount you need to under or overexpose is going to be relative to what's in your scene. So for me, the classic scenario for this is outdoor portraits. It could be at a wedding. It could be just doing a shoot with a couple, or it might be that you're shooting a person on their own outside. Part of this, though, is an aesthetic choice that we have to make. And there's something I really want to mention about this because I think that people get a little bit confused, and sometimes I think the purists chase technical correctness over what actually looks good. And what I mean by this is, let's say it's a bright sunny day, blue sky, and you're taking a picture of a bride on her own. Just doesn't matter what you shoot, just take this as an example. And you see that your bride looks underexposed. But when the bride is underexposed, you get this blue sky. Someone who wants to have the most technically correct picture may move the bride to somewhere where there's better lighting on the bride. They might introduce a reflector, or they might introduce off-camera lighting. The other option, which is what you see a lot of wedding photographers do, is that they just raise the exposure till it's correct for the person and then let the sky blow. And that technique of doing that, of overexposing like that, gets criticized a lot. Have a look at this picture I took of Lisa where I did this. Now, I did this deliberately. I wanted to overexpose like this because there's a couple of reasons why. It gives this bright and airy look. Okay, this is an aesthetic choice. If I introduce flash and then have a blue sky, it's going to look completely different. It's a very different feeling and a very different vibe. It's not one that I think would go with what she's wearing and the day and the location. I don't think that would match. Blue, the primary colours in particular, they're very distracting. So I would like to keep things in a more neutral pastel range because that's more pleasing than have suddenly this big lump of blue. So when we let the sky go, when we blow out the sky, it looks natural. And in fact, on most summer's days, that's what we actually see with our eyes. It's so bright. Sometimes we can see blue looking up, but when we're looking over towards where the sun is in the background, we don't see that stuff. Now, we could get that back if we underexpose heavily and introduce flash, but It's not about then saying, look, I have exposed properly for both her and the sky. Yes, but it doesn't look good. And that's the difference. We need to make choices. But the whole reason that a lot of the natural light photographers are very popular is because their work is aesthetically pleasing and it's hard to do. But that situation of blowing the sky like that tends to happen when we're really facing quite much more directly towards the sun. When we switch off to the side, we'll get those blue skies because the dynamic range is lower in the picture. Really desaturate the sky, and then that can look beautiful. You can get these beautiful muted tones, and you bring the saturation range of the sky into the rest of the picture. So if we don't overexpose, what we run the risk of is our subject being so dark that then we have to do a sort of correction in post that makes their skin muddy and the picture isn't clear. We start to introduce a lot of noise when we have to boost the exposure that much. So how do we do it? What are we looking for? I think one of the easy ways to do this is if you've got a camera that has the blinking highlights on playback, you can look and see the areas that are blowing. So a lot of cameras, when you press play, like to replay your images, there's an info button or a way of cycling. Sometimes you press the up and down on a keypad or something, and you can cycle through the different view modes. You get the whole picture with no information and camera information, and then you can get like a histogram. And usually one of them is to have a picture with blinking highlights so you can see the parts of the picture that are blown. So if you're that's one of the easy ways of doing this, because you can say what parts are acceptable to blow and what isn't, and then you can just work based on that and see, does my subject look correctly exposed? But that is the other way to do this, is to just expose properly for your subject and just let everything else go. Another easy way to do this, using the histogram for overexposure, is a little bit tricky at times because you'll overexpose and you'll see the meter going up at the side of the histogram on the right hand side, but you won't know how much of the picture is blowing. You can see the stuff is blowing, but you don't know which parts necessarily. So if you're going to do it like that, then you might have to be cautious with it, and you might end up still underexposing slightly in order to make sure that things don't blow. But the other thing you've got is just the image review on your camera. Just take a picture and look at it and say, zoom in a little bit and say, does that look like I'm blowing? Because you can see if there's like no detail or anything, you can see it's blown as well. So it shouldn't be too hard. When you're doing overexposure though, for what camera modes to use, I massively favor using manual mode, because the position of the sun, like if we're doing this outdoors, for example, the sun is going to be somewhere in your kind of range in front of you. And the brightness variations that you're going to get by moving your camera even slightly like this is going to be huge all the time in the background. So your exposure could end up changing quite a bit. I think it's just easier to shoot this in manual mode, and like why not take the chance to shoot something like that in manual. And I think that the same is true if we're talking about a drastic change for underexposures as well. It's more a case of like, are you picking slightly different angles, or are you kind of shooting the same thing and the person's moving? But even then, it's like, why not just be in manual mode anyway? So exposure compensation's really good in aperture priority when you want to just grab a few shots in one position, and it's okay if they're a little bit out, they're changing slightly, and then you're moving to the next bit and you want to keep working quickly. So that's for me the key difference, is that you want to keep the flow and the pace going, and you're constantly moving around and taking different angles. So you can say, in this area here, you've worked it out, you've looked at it, your exposure compensation at, let's say, +1 1/3 stops is getting you where you want to be. You can then work with that and keep it there, but you need to keep checking and keep making sure that it's okay. But that's the same for manual mode as well. As you move around, you've really got to check it. But for faster paced work like that, definitely aperture priority with auto ISO is better for fast paced work. You want to be focusing on that. And for anything where you're going to work a scene for a little while, then stay in manual mode and have consistent exposures, because when you come to edit, you can batch edit really fast. You can go, okay, this scene, you edit the first picture, and then you can apply it to the whole bunch in Lightroom or whatever editing software you use. That means you can get through a whole section of work really, really quickly, rather than having to then make, I know you can like exposure match and all this stuff, but it's never quite right because you're doing more than just matching exposures. You're changing where the highlights end. Does that make sense? Like, the problem with aperture priority is that you're shooting pictures at different exposures, and that means certain highlights will clip in certain pictures in certain areas and not in others because your exposure's moving. Whereas if you shoot that in manual mode, it's always going to be the same for each picture. So even if you can exposure match, it's not the same thing because where your highlights end will vary in each picture depending on how the camera's chosen to expose. I'd like to know from you guys, did that make sense? Have you tried overexposing like this yourself? Do you disagree or agree with what I've said? Let me know in the comments. I'm open to like someone saying, no, just don't come out with like, just use flash, or you get it? Like, I know all of that. No, stop it. No. Anyway, I've rambled on long enough. Take care. Bye-bye.